So now we're going to get into the meat of the lecture, which is the epistemological debates about among across these social sciences. And basically by epistemological debates, I mean, what are the debates about what constitutes knowledge in the social sciences? That's what epistemological debates is what is the nature of knowledge and how do we gain knowledge? And how as a social scientist do we know what knowledge is true and what knowledge isn't true? And within these social sciences, there's a lot of debates about what is true, what is knowledge, how do we get knowledge, what knowledge is valid. And every social science has their own epistemological debates. In sociology, there's four main ones. The first one is positivism versus interpretivism. Positivism is the idea that there can be positive knowledge about society. Just like in biology, we can look into a microscope and say, yes, there is a cell and the cell is reproducing and there's atoms within the cell. That's positivism. And sociologists who are positivists say we can have with the same degree of certainty about society as we do about the cell. Basically, we can look at society through a sociological microscope and be certain, absolutely certain, that things are happening in a certain way. We call these social facts. Um, Interpretivists, on the other hand, argue that human behavior is inherently subjective and it requires understanding to attach meaning to people's actions, and there is no such thing as a social fact. There is no such thing as being positive that something exists in the same way that we can look at a cell on a microscope. An interpreter said that everything is open to interpretation, everything is relative, and we can't make a social fact. Social constructionism is another really central argument within sociology. And social constructionism basically argues that social realities like gender or race are not inherent, but they are actively constructed through interactions and interpretation. And basically, we could use an example of social constructionism for disability, for example. So I study, one of the things that I study is deafness. And one of the arguments is from a positivist or an anti-social constructionist lens is that deafness is a real thing. There are ears that don't work and the same way that other people's ears work. And so deafness is a real disability. And people who are born deaf are born disabled and they are going to have problems communicating and getting jobs and participating in society because they are disabled because they are deaf. The social constructionist argument, on the other hand, argues that yes, there are people who are born with ears that don't work the same way as everyone else's does. However, the deafness as a disability is a social construct. It's a social construction. If those people were born into a society where everyone had ears that didn't work, they wouldn't be disabled at all, would they? Everybody would speak the same sign language. All of the services would be geared to people who speak sign language. all of the um, all of the political system would be geared to people who speak sign language. All of the education system would be geared to people who speak sign language. So there would be no disability. They would be just like everyone else. They wouldn't be deaf. They would be just like everyone else. Just like, for example, you and I'm hearing. I don't know if you're hearing, but I am hearing, and I usually don't think about the fact that I'm hearing because it's normal. And so if people who had ears that don't work like everyone else's were born into a society where everyone else was like them, there would be no such thing as deafness. Just like we don't think about being hearing, people who are deaf wouldn't think about themselves being deaf. So that's the idea of social constructionism. Sociologists also look at power and knowledge, and I mentioned this earlier. And we talk about how dominant groups often shape knowledge to maintain their power. An example of this is President Trump recently changed the name of the Gulf of Mexico to be the Gulf of America. And sociologists would say because he's in a position of power, he has the ability to actually shape knowledge or shape facts in a very distinct and positive kind of way. He's been able to declare now it's the Gulf of America. And so sociologists would look at that and say, look at how power is influencing knowledge. And in 20 or 30 years, is everyone just going to reflexively refer to it as the Gulf of America and not remember that at one time, a person in a position of power actually used his power to change the name of that body of water? The last main debate that exists within sociology is the role of the researcher. And we talk about the idea of positionality, which is where do you stand in the context of your own research. So, for example, when I'm doing research on deafness, I reflect on the fact that I'm hearing. However, I have a lot of deaf friends, and my deaf friends have informed me and influenced me about my own opinions about deafness and cochlear implants and deaf technology and the kinds of things that I study. And so I need to be aware of my own positionality and my own opinions going into my research. How does my own position, for example, as a cis white woman living in the Northwest United States, how does that influence my research if I'm doing research in China? For example, how does that influence my research if I'm doing research with men of color who live on the streets? And so all of those things actually influence my research, influence my findings, influence my position on the subject. Psychology has a lot of debates. One of the main ones is behaviorism versus cognitive psychology. So the question here is behaviorists say, do we study observable behaviors, such as do people go to work at the same time every morning? Do they wake up at the same time every morning? Or do we study mental processes, which would be cognitive psychology? And the mental process might be that I want to be responsible. So therefore, I go to work at the same time every morning. I wake up at the same time every morning. So the internal mental process, the cognitive process is I want to be responsible. So a goal or a value. And the observable behavior is that I wake up at the same time every morning and go to work at the same time every morning. That's the behavior or the observable behavior. Another thing that psychology looks at is a role of introspection. So here we say that in the past, behaviorists often rejected the role of introspection as a reliable method for studying the mind because they said it's too subjective. Whereas cognitive psychologists say, we want to incorporate the introspective reports alongside other data sources. So, for example, a cognitive psychologist may ask you, how do you feel about waking up at the same time every morning? What is driving you to wake up at the same time every morning? Why do you wake up at the same time every morning? Whereas a behaviorist would say, all that stuff is subjective, it doesn't matter. We just want to see that they wake up at the same time every morning. The third main debate within psychology is the nature of mental states. So, are mental states real entities or simply constructs used to explain behavior, which is called anti realism? So, an example of this would be an emotion, for example. So, having the emotion of anger, is that real entity? Or is it mainly just something that humans have come up with to explain our behavior, like punching a wall? So if someone punches a wall, we say, well, they're angry. And so someone who is a realist would say anger is a real thing that caused this person to punch the wall. Whereas an anti realist would say, no, this person just punched the wall. And we use a social construct, the idea of anger, to explain why they punched the wall. Going on more with psychology. Oh, so going on with psychology, we also look at subjectivity, which is understanding how subjective experiences like emotions and pain, while considering potential biases introduced by the observer and the observed. So this is similar to the positionality that I talked about with sociology, looking at potential biases. So, for example, if a psychologist is a person of color who is a female, what is the bias? Who is a professor, let's say, in an academy? What is the bias when they are studying someone who is different from them or the same as them? What are the biases that are introduced by that? And the last thing that psychologists, the last main epistemological debate existing within psychology today is the social and cultural context. So they want to know, are these theories that psychologists develop about the mind and behavior, can they be generalized across different cultures and different social contexts? Or are they specific to specific cultures and specific social contexts? So, for example, if there's a theory that says that a developmental theory that says that people go through 6 stages in their human development before they reach adulthood. Does that theory hold across all cultures and all social contexts? Or is it only specific to, for example, Western culture? Anthropology also has a lot of debates. One of the main debates in anthropology is objectivity versus subjectivity. So we want to know whether or not anthropologists can achieve true objectivity when studying other cultures, given their own cultural background and biases. So again, this goes back to subjectivity in psychology and positionality in sociology. How much do our own biases and our own backgrounds influence our interpretation? A big thing that kind of haunts anthropology is the impact of colonialism. So, anthropological research started really as a colonialist project where Western researchers went into non Western societies to study the natives. And while anthropology no longer looks like that, anthropologists, for example, can study people in their own cultures. An anthropologist, a white American anthropologist, can go into a white American school and study schools from an anthropological perspective. So it no longer has the same, no longer always has the same colonialist nature that it used to, but it still kind of haunts the field of anthropology. And anthropologists are very sensitive to not being colonialist in their approach to their work. Another debate, and you'll see that this mirrors what psychologists and sociologists are grappling with, is whether culture should be understood solely within their own context, which is called cultural relativism, or if there are universal human values and principles that can be applied across cultures. So, an example of this would be the debate around female genital mutilation or female genital cutting, it is more preferably called. So, female genital cutting is a practice that exists in some parts of Africa and the Middle East, in which girls' clitorises or vaginas are altered for different cultural reasons. And cultural relativists, who are anthropologists, would say, you know what? That's what is accepted in their culture. It is normal within their culture, and we should respect that as part of their culture. People who are universalists would say absolutely there should be some ground rules that all cultures follow, and cutting off or mutilating the clitorises of young girls while they're not under anesthesia should be wrong, should be considered wrong under all circumstances, and we shouldn't be relativists. Another debate, it relies on indigenous knowledge systems. And anthropologists want to be more respectful of indigenous knowledge and say, what is the knowledge that exists within this culture? And we want to respect this knowledge, not necessarily the knowledge that we come in as scientists. So again, this goes back to the debate of colonialism and saying we don't want to impose our values on these other cultures. And I want to emphasize, and you'll see this in a minute, I want to emphasize that anthropologists nowadays don't only study other cultures. They also study, like I gave you the example of an anthropologist studying schools, a Western anthropologist studying Western schools. But what is the indigenous knowledge that exists within that school? What do the teachers have to say? What do the students have to say? What do the administrators have to say? So anthropologists are giving more weight to the local knowledge within the context that they're studying. Now, economics. We have positivism versus anti-positivism. Now, you have heard about positivism already when I talked about sociology. So positivism holds that economics should be based on empirical observation and testable hypotheses, aiming for objective and value-free analysis. So just like what the sociologists say, that we can have positive social knowledge, economics say we can have positive economics knowledge. Anti-positivists, however, say that economic systems are complex and subjective and require an interpretive approach that incorporates social and political factors, including values and ethical considerations. So this really looks like that same debate that we talk about in sociology. Is it interpretivist or is it positivist? Another thing that economics struggles with more so than any of the other social scientists is the role of models. So, model based realism really looks at simplified economic models where they use numbers and symbols to understand really complex economic phenomena, even if they don't perfectly capture reality. Now, critics of these models say that these models oversimplify reality and they misrepresent real world issues and they have severe limitations because they rely really on mathematics to understand social reality. Other debates within economics are methodological individualism. So, economic phenomena can be understood by analyzing the decisions of individual agents. So these people would say, these economists would say, we look at person A and what they do, person B and what they do, and person C and what they do, and we look at all these individual decisions. Whereas people who are collectivists, economists who are collectivists, say we need to look at the collective action, the social structures, and the individual institutional constraints that influence individual behavior. So people who are collectivists say that individual behavior is not enough. Individual behavior is influenced by institutions, it's influenced by social structure, and it's influenced by collective action. And we can't understand an economic system without understanding the social structures behind them. The next problem within economics is the problem of induction. So, how do we generalize economic laws based on limited data and observation, given the dynamics and ever changing nature of economies? So, basically, what this means is that how do we generalize laws when economies and economics is constantly changing? If you think, for example, even in the last several weeks, our stock market has changed, our economy has changed, the price of eggs has skyrocketed. I went to the store the other day, eggs were $35. So how do we generalize economic laws when eggs were $6 3 months ago? So how do we generalize economics when we have this dynamism in the system? And then the last main debate within economics is subjectivity of value. And this is the idea that the nature of individual value judgments and utility judgments are very subjective and cannot be measured objectively. And again, you'll see this debate come up in psychology, in sociology, in anthropology, and for political science for that matter, which is this, how subjective are we as social scientists when we study these objects of studies, whether it's the economy, whether it's society, whether it's culture. How do we put aside our own individual subjectivity and study things in an objective way? And the last debate that we're going to talk about is within political scientists, within political science. So political scientists ask questions like, how does disagreement affect society? How does ignorance, propaganda, or misinformation affect the legitimacy of collective decisions? And they have an epistemological question, such as how does epistemological knowledge affect political decisions? And of course, how are marginalized groups in a position of epistemological privilege?